What role does the union play in places like Germany or Finland?
Yeah, I think what we have systems where unions are actually protagonists of reform. You know, I think it varies a lot across countries, and in a sense, you can say, well, every education system gets the union it deserves. It's sort of the union. Yeah, I think the way the unions work is often a reflection of the way an education system is structured. If you have an industrial work environment, you get unions that defend industrial interests. If you have a professional work environment, unions have to work a lot harder to support their professions. You know, unions are paid by their members, and their members are a lot more demanding in a work environment. You spoke about performance-based pay. You know, Sweden is a country where the unions have worked with the government on a system of individual pay, performance-related, and so these things can be done with the unions. It's just a matter of how to do them, and I think part of the issue is that high-performing countries usually involve the unions not just in the implementation of reforms, but in the design of reforms. So they're part of the picture from the beginning. That doesn't mean necessarily a cozy relationship. There's always confrontation, but it means that everybody knows, you know, what's the objective and what we are trying to do. Canada, the province of Ontario, is a really good example that has turned around that relationship between government and unions in a very short time towards one that is really collaborative, constructive. I think it varies a lot across countries. You can go, I think the worst situations in countries like Mexico, where there is just no dialogue, no interaction, and then you get very negative attitudes on both parts.
And where do we fit in the United States?
I think there's a lot of variability. You know, I think there is not, I mean, the US is quite varied in that picture. But clearly, I think most countries can learn a lot in how to improve that work relationship, and unions as well, to become sort of true owners of a profession rather than just of the small slice that is related to salaries and working hours and things like this. No?
I wanted to get into the diversity issue and how that relates to PISA scores, because that has been one area where PISA has been criticized a lot, particularly with regard to the United States, that we're a very heterogeneous population in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, language, and urban, rural. I mean, just people come from a lot of different cultural backgrounds. We have one of the poorest, in terms of proportion, we have one of the poorest student populations. And I'm wondering, is it fair to not really look at that when you're ranking countries based on PISA?
Actually, we do look at that quite intensively when we compare countries. And you know, you spoke of Singapore. Singapore is a lot more diverse on most of the dimensions that you outline, on wealth, on religion, on ethnic background, on linguistic background. But what that country succeeds with is in moderating that diversity. I think you're quite right. The context of an education system is a challenge. But the test of truth for an education system is how it moderates that context. And you go to Sweden now, they have a high proportion of immigrants, and many of these immigrants from much more sort of challenging backgrounds than in the United States. Linguistically, socioeconomically, they take on a lot of refugees that have no place to go. But Sweden succeeds in integrating those people very quickly. So I think it's true, countries have their different challenges. I wouldn't rate the United States as having that much of a challenge compared to many other nations. But still, I think it's important to reflect that, but we need to measure the success of systems to cope with that and to moderate diversity. And what you have to conclude when you look at those data is that there are a lot of countries that are a lot more successful than the United States in moderating socioeconomic diversity. That is, students from different backgrounds come out more equal, rather than in the United States, where they come out more unequal the older they grow in the system. It's not only the United States. My country, Germany, has very much the same kind of problems. But I think we need to recognize that there are some systems doing a lot better. And again, you know, that shows what is possible. The interesting issue of international comparison is not to rank countries on any dimension, but to show really what you can achieve. Look to Singapore, look to China, all countries with huge social challenges. And still they succeed to sort of capitalize on the talent of different people. They see diversity not as the problem of the education system, but in a sense the potential of good learning, good instruction.
Of course, those are smaller countries. For instance, Finland, the entire population
Sure.
is smaller than the
Yeah.
student population of California.
Yeah.
So you have that.
Yeah.
Some of those countries you mentioned, like even in Shanghai and
Yeah.
in Singapore, have a very powerful central government. And in this country, it's really the states and further down into the local districts that determine
Sure.
a lot of what happens. So is there an example of a place, a country, or even a state within a country where you can say, here's what they did on a smaller scale. Here's someone who learned from PISA and has started to make those changes?
In the United States, I think there's a lot of states who are really working very hard to, they not just from PISA, but they have looked at PISA and then looked at what high-performing nations do. I've been to Delaware, they've been very intensively looking at, but I think there are a lot of states now that are actually trying to do that. And yeah, you know, the size of system, there are a lot of aspects in which countries differ, but you know, if all countries would be the same, we couldn't learn anything from each other. I think the diversity is exactly where I think the wealth of that information is. And you can see on any of the dimensions in which the United States is challenged, you mentioned immigration, you mentioned social background, poverty, you find countries that are a lot worse off. And then, you know, if you find some among them that do a better job, that's opening up possibilities to look at, you know. I would actually argue, I mean, if you look at this seriously, you find that on overall, the United States is really well positioned. Now, the United States is one of the richest countries in the world. The United States has one of the best educated adult populations, which means parents are better educated in the United States than they are in other countries, and that surely is a big asset for the education of your children. You find that poverty in the United States is a problem, but it's actually much less of a problem than in many of the industrialized countries. So. But again, you know, looking at how different systems, it's not as looking at the challenges is important, but more interesting is how different systems deal with those challenges.
How much, in other countries, is there much of a debate over what students should be learning? In the United States, we have still a lot of debate over whether we should be teaching religion in schools and religious beliefs. Is that very far behind where other schools are? I mean, other countries are right now?
I think the struggle in finding, you know, what are the kind of competences, the knowledge, skills, attitudes that are important in life, that are important in school, that is a debate that every country has. It's a continual debate because the demand for skills is changing every day in life and work, and so on, and so there's a lot of curriculum reform and standards going on in many countries. And it's not just, you know, whether to teach math or science, but how to teach those things. Now, like those fields evolve a lot, you know, science, environmental science probably was much less important in the past than it is today. Countries paying a lot more attention to those aspects. Collaborative skills, you know, we know that in today's world you don't no longer work by yourself. Innovation is no longer about you having a great idea, but about how you can collaborate, share, develop jointly ideas, and so on. And I think there's a lot of discussion in many countries on this. Also a lot of controversy, you know, who should decide? You know, is it something that academics should decide? As in some countries, is that something that people from all fields of life and work should decide? Very, very important debates.
Well, what's the big question that schools or education systems should ask in order to start developing a better system? Where do you begin?
You mean in terms of curriculum development, or?
Well, let's say take the United States. What would be the first three things that we should start to do in order to bring ourselves back up to that top of the pack?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is what the United States has done, is develop a set of clear aspirations of what good performance looks like, and like the Common Core standards. I think that's a very, very important starting point, and it's quite well benchmarked against what happens internationally. The second step then is a harder one, and that is basically building that capacity for delivering those Common Core standards at the front line. And that's about attracting the best people into the teaching profession, developing those into really great teachers, building the kind of support for continuous professional development, and so on. That's the big challenge, I think, that is in front of the United States, sort of to build really a high-quality teaching profession. And, you know, otherwise these Common Core standards remain an aspiration. And the third aspect for the United States is probably even more difficult, but it's about finding a more equitable approach to resourcing, finding ways to attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, to get the best principals into the most difficult schools, to ensure that spending is no longer regressive as it is currently, but that basically the money gets there where the challenges are greatest and where money can make most of the difference.
And so one final question, in a country like this with 50 states and thousands of school districts that each have a measure of autonomy, how do we get to the front lines? How do we get those resources and the conversation happening?
Yeah, I think the governance issue is always difficult. But, you know, in most high-performing systems, schools have greater autonomy than they have in the United States. You know, autonomy doesn't have to be in conflict with strong governance systems. And the question is not, I don't believe that if you had a government, a central government that could decide on all these things, that there would be necessarily anything better. You know, Canada is a federal country that is really very successful. Again, you know, countries have strong sets of school autonomy. I think the question is to build greater coherence in this, to build greater articulation, and, you know, having sort of the common core standards, or states really figuring out, you know, what schools or what education should be achieving, but then building a lot more capacity at the front line to actually implement this in creative ways. What should I teach to my students today in this setting? I think that's the challenge. I don't really think that the governance architecture in the United States should stand in the way of improvement. You know, and it's not so. I think where the United States, the only area where the United States is really different from many high-performing systems is the high level of discretion that is with districts. I would actually think that the United States has a lot of power at the district level, but actually quite less power than many other countries at the school level, from our data at least. Mm-hmm. And I think that's to work on, you know, that teachers, schools do have the means they need to address their own learning environment. But I don't see that so negative. I don't think that that the governance structures necessarily stand in the way of improvement.
Andreas Schleicher, thank you very much for speaking with us today. I'm Catherine Barron, and this is Thoughts on Public Education.